Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to the webinar this week. This is the Kentucky Monthly Climate Perspective on Drought and Hydrologic Conditions for December 2019. I am Megan Schargorodski, and I will be running the webinar, and Dr. Stuart Foster will be doing most of the talking. And I'll go ahead and pass it on to you, Stu.
Thanks, Megan. I had to get unmuted there. So there are probably a lot of folks that like to keep me muted. But welcome everyone, new and returning folks to our monthly webinar on climate conditions and hydrologic conditions, focusing on drought. This series is sponsored through the National Integrated Drought Information System in coordination with the Midwest Drought Early Warning System. And we've got a lot of partners here that contribute to this, as was highlighted with the logos there on the title page. So keep in mind that our next webinar will be in January, and we pushed it back from the first to the second Thursday. So it's going to be January 9th. We were concerned that we wouldn't have a lot of folks on the second, and so we're pushing it back on this one-time basis. Otherwise, we normally have these on the first Thursday of the month. And we'll be recording this and making it available for listening in the future. Okay, Megan, can you? Yeah, thank you. Okay, we'll take a look, as we always do, at recent conditions, and then talk a little bit about impacts, give an outlook in terms of weather and climate for the next month, and even looking out the season, and then we'll have time for any question discussions. So got a couple photos on the left highlighting some of the major weather events during the month that we'll talk about. One was the early snow. Not a record, but unusually early for most areas of Kentucky to have snow as soon as November 12th. And then toward the end of the month, some heavy rains and some minor flooding in some areas. So we'll talk about that and more as we go along. Start out with our 30-day precipitation totals. The radar estimates in terms of the color-coded map with our Kentucky Mesonet observed values overlaid with that. And we see that November was a particularly wet month. We had precipitation throughout the state, at least 3 inches plus in the northern tip there in the Cincinnati metro area, with many locations receiving 6 or 7 inches of rain across the period of the month, or the last 30 days, I should say. So a very wet November, and again, continuing that bounce back from the flash drought earlier this summer. 60-day totals, again, basically take what you saw there on the 30-day totals and double that in many cases, some cases even more so. And we've got precipitation totals that are 15 inches or more in some areas. Again, for the 2 months combined, generally abundant precipitation throughout the state. We'll go notice, so go back just a second, Megan, to the previous slide, if you would. Okay, well, okay, go ahead. Wasn't what I was looking for. So we'll go ahead and move forward. So a very wet period for October and November. And note that October period captured the first rainfall event that really helped to bust out of that flash drought. And this goes back then 90 days. This map looks almost exactly like the previous map and highlights the fact that once you go back 90 days, you get into that September period where we averaged less than 1/4 of an inch of rain over the entire state. So we're adding some very nominal amounts of precipitation in that 90-day outlook or 90-day summary. So here, putting those last 3 maps into perspective of what we would consider normal, we can see again that the top left, this is actually the map that I wanted to refer back to, the 30-day precipitation relative to normal based on radar estimates. Those blues, light blues in there, are anywhere from 150 to 200% of normal, and those were peak areas and covered much of the state. And then other parts of the state were still above normal precipitation for that period. But notice that once you get outside of Kentucky, if you go a little bit north into Ohio and into central Indiana or Illinois, and likewise, if you go down the southern half of Tennessee, it's a different story. Those areas were typically normal to below normal precipitation for that 30-day period. So Kentucky was really a bullseye regionally in terms of precipitation, largely for the month of November. 60-day relative to normal, again, you're looking at 150 to 200%. In some cases across central Kentucky, as much as are approaching 300% of normal precipitation. And then the 90-day total, again, those values are much lower, still above normal precipitation for that 90-day period, but taking into fact the dry conditions at the first third of that period, you can see that those totals are above normal but close to normal. Key thing there is just to show how well we bounced back from the dry conditions in September and early October. Okay. Look at temperature departures. Whether you look at high temperatures or low temperatures, left or right side there, both cases we were well below normal in terms of the temperature for the month. And this turned out to be pretty consistent with what the outlook was from the Climate Prediction Center for the month. So again, we're kind of bouncing back from that a little bit this month so far. Soil moisture and groundwater. Again, soil moisture, modeled soil or calculated soil moisture percentiles show Kentucky to be well above average in terms of soil moisture levels across the entire state, with some areas reaching up to the 80th percentile based on historical values. And then groundwater levels to be typically about where you would expect, although there's a little hint of below normal groundwater, again, perhaps reflecting some of the lasting impacts from the drought conditions earlier this year. But again, those conditions are improving, certainly have been over the last month or so. Looking at our soil moisture graphs, and again, we've got over 40 stations, but I've picked these and been working with them consistently for the last few months just to try to get some kind of representative coverage across different parts of the state. And you know, can't hardly go through all of the graphs here in the presentation, but Fulton County, far western part of the state, perhaps the wettest part of the state throughout the course of the year, and then Henderson County up along the Ohio River, Boyle County over more in central part of the state, Breathitt County in the eastern part. And in each case, you can see very clearly the imprint of the flash drought, so starting at some point in August and then ending in October. And key thing here is that soil moisture levels have recovered well, generally at all depths from that period. 7-day stream flows have been running above normal to much above normal and even in the high category there across most of the state, and again reflecting some heavy precipitation that we had there at the end of November. Again, stream flows hydrologically as such, we have also bounced back quite well from the dry conditions earlier on. And that 28-day average is a little bit lower because we're averaging over a longer period of time that includes more than just that exceptionally wet period of the last week. But nonetheless, we're looking at stream flows that are normal to above normal to much above normal across the state. Current flooding conditions, we bring this map back into the presentation here this month because we've got some minor flooding, different locations across the state, kind of highlighting there on the Green River with a few locations. But again, this is only very minor flooding in our area. Certainly, I think, folks, when you look up in the lower Ohio River and then up into Indiana, the Wabash River, such, you recall that this was an area that suffered from extensive and prolonged flooding earlier this year. And so there's certainly some concern to see that coming back so quickly after our very dry conditions. So something to keep an eye on here going forward. U.S. Drought Monitor picture looks a whole lot better than it did a couple months ago. And really no evidence of drought anywhere in the Midwest and very little in the Great Plains, only in the southern part there, portions of Kansas and Oklahoma down into Texas. So for the most part, if we look at the eastern U.S., we don't have any drought concerns any longer in Kentucky. And when we look to our south, again, conditions are rather benign for the most part there. And kind of keep an eye on that because frequently when we do have drought, it kind of encroaches upon us from the south. Not always, it can, each one's unique, but certainly something to keep an eye on. And again, that previous map looked a whole lot better than a month or two ago. This is looking at change in the drought monitor status over the last month. And we can see that in the southeast, there have been improvements of 1, 2, or even 3 classes, reflecting the abundant rainfall in many areas, and including impacts there in southeastern Kentucky. Do see some degradation of drier conditions setting in the southern part of Florida, and then getting out into the southern plains there, and likewise a little bit on the west coast. Taking a look at impacts over the last month, we see, again, really three major events. We had the early snowfall on the 12th of November, and reports of, excuse me, anywhere from 1 to 3 inches across a large portion of the state, really. So it's a pretty widespread event. Other than schools being closed, no significant impacts of that snow. It was more just of interest because of its early occurrence in the season. And then we got toward the end of the month, things got more active. November 27th, we had very strong winds across the state, not in association with thunderstorms moving through. And those winds in some cases peaked at above 50 miles per hour, and very widespread where we had winds of 40 miles an hour plus. There was some damage, very sporadic across the state. A roof associated with a garage or mobile home, some trees down. I think there was a tower that was snapped in one location, but nothing major damage-wise. And then the last event there, the very heavy rainfall At the end of the month there, November 30th, December 1st, we had amounts that in some cases were exceeding 3-4 inches of precipitation. And that led to some minor flooding that was pretty widespread in several counties across the state, and roads being closed in many cases for a period of time. There were some water rescues that were documented there in Hardin, Henderson, and Grayson counties. Moving on to the agricultural side of things, can talk to Matt Dixon there at the UK Ag Weather Center. Always do excellent work there, and actually, I guess email exchange. Wanted to pass along that we still have some concerns in terms of pasture conditions. Hay inventories remain a concern, and ag specialists have been recommending producers to secure additional hay if available. Been some reports of cattle being sold off. Basically, again, supply and demand when it comes to available feed going into the winter months. Certainly the last couple winters, and last winter in particular, there was a lot of concern about the very wet field conditions, and combining that with cloudy, damp weather. So with the return of wet conditions over the last couple months, that's certainly something that comes back onto the radar screen again, unfortunately. A little bit too early to project how that may play out, but it's something to, again, keep in mind here going forward. And then otherwise, we look at the crops. So winter wheat has been tracking close to 5-year average in terms of planting and emergence and such at this point. So other than the kind of ongoing concerns associated with the drought and pasture and feed conditions there on livestock, things seem to be pretty reasonable in terms of the ag sector. Now looking ahead, the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast indicates that we could expect somewhere around an inch of rain, depending on where you're located across the state. Maybe a little bit heavier amounts to our south there in the southeast, but we'll keep an eye on that. Otherwise, much lower totals there out into the plains. So really see a kind of a river of moisture there coming up out of the Gulf that could affect us a bit. But otherwise, an inch over a week is about typical for this time of year. 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day precipitation outlooks. Again, both indicating an enhanced probability of above normal precipitation for Kentucky, and probably of equal importance in terms of assessing those probabilities, the fact that most of the nation is targeted as having an enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation for that period. And again, a little bit more so in the 6 to 10 day outlook in the southeast, kind of reflected, I think, in that last 7-day QPF that we just looked at. Getting into the winter season ahead of us, we start to think a little bit more about the El Nino, La Nina, the so-called ENSO situation. And so we brought that back in here. We're currently in a neutral phase. And the projection, this is a little bit dated, but it was the most recently available from mid-November, and shows on the lower right that the greatest likelihood going forward is that we will remain in a neutral phase, neutral ENSO phase, with a greater likelihood that we could move back into an El Nino, and much less likelihood that we would be moving toward a La Nina over the current winter season. So again, we'll keep an eye on that, but at this time, there's no sense of ENSO kind of steering our weather in a particular direction. Okay. The monthly outlook as such then, in contrast to the November outlook, we're anticipating a likelihood of above normal temperatures for the month of December. And you can see that really a bullseye there in the southern plains, but we have more than between a 40 and 50% likelihood of above normal temperatures, and a correspondingly less likelihood of below normal temperatures for that period. And then in looking at precipitation, again, a slightly enhanced about 40% likelihood of above normal precipitation. I think you take a look at that and you couple that with the fact that we've had a couple wet months in a row already, and suggest that there's a reasonable likelihood of continuing this wet weather pattern that we've been seeing. Seasonally, kind of looking out through the winter, December, January, February, temperature-wise, equal chances for most of Kentucky of above, below, or near normal. Some portions of southeastern Kentucky, a slightly enhanced likelihood of warmer than normal conditions. Otherwise, it's basically suggesting that the warmth's going to be confined more to the coastal regions and such. When you get into the interior of the continent, more of an equal chances area there. And then precipitation, again, a slightly elevated likelihood of above normal precipitation for Kentucky, and then likewise really across the northern tier of the United States, but some hint of dryness perhaps developing more to our south. And then from our folks at the Ohio River Forecast Center, the average mean daily stream flow outlook for December shows that we can generally expect normal to above normal stream flows for locations across the state. There's one anomaly there where a projection of a below normal amount is. I'm not sure I'd put too much credence in that one value there. But anyway, we've been a little bit, again, above normal stream flows. We're coming down from that a little bit now. We expect to stay normal to above normal going through December. And then a seasonal flood outlook. Again, given that we do have some elevated stream levels, areas where there's a greater than 50% chance of exceeding flood levels at some point throughout the winter. So December, January, and February. So it's looking at current stream flows, soil moisture conditions, and also looking at outlooks going forward. And again, we see some areas where we see a greater than 50% chance of minor long-range flood risk. That's in the orange, and then the red has a little bit higher moderate risk of flooding on a long-term basis. So again, we'll keep an eye on that, and as we get outside of Kentucky, folks up in the Midwest again are certainly going to be focused on that quite a bit too. So summarizing, precipitation well above normal in November across the entire state, as heavy rainfall events produce minor flooding in many areas. The effects of the late summer flash drought do linger still a little bit for agriculture, and again, those impacts in terms of hay and feed supply for livestock and pasture conditions, those are not going to go away throughout the winter months, and it may take some time next year for pastures to recover, and farmers may have to invest in trying to bring those back next year. Public water suppliers are meeting demands. There still are a couple systems in southeastern Kentucky that are, I guess, in the recovering stage, but there are no issues for water users in those areas. And then looking ahead, December brings an enhanced likelihood of both above normal temperatures and above normal precipitation as we close out the year. And I guess I'll wrap up by saying that if that plays out, then 2019 is going to go down as a extremely interesting year from a climatological standpoint, in the sense that we have a possibility of being a top 5 year in terms of wet conditions across the state. We'll see how it plays out. But with that said, again, it would be a top 5 year with a record dry September embedded in that, and a very significant flash drought. So we'll come back in a month and see how things materialize, and look forward to talking with you all again at that time. So have a little bit of time if there are any questions or any topics you'd like to talk about a little bit. I'll send it back to Megan, and she can open things up to see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you for the great presentation, Stu. If anybody has any questions or wants more detail on something that we covered, please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask, or you can ask in the chat as well if you need to. We'll give it a few minutes before we wrap up. All right, if there are no further questions, we can go ahead and wrap up the webinar. As Dr. Foster mentioned earlier on, the next regularly scheduled webinar will be January 9th, which is the second Thursday of January, not the first. And it'll be at the same time, and we will send out an email for registration for that in the coming weeks. I will also email out the recording of this webinar for your future reference and for those who aren't able to attend. Thank you so much, and have a great holiday season.